My name is Florence Perkins Bailey. I was born on a farm in Spink County, South Dakota. I lived there 5 years until my father died of the 1918 flu pneumonia. My mother and I eventually moved to Hitchcock, South Dakota with my paternal grandparents and lived there for a year. I had a serious accident to my right eye when I was 6 years old. When I was in the second grade in Hitchcock, we moved to Aberdeen, South Dakota. In Aberdeen, I finished grade school, high school, and went into nurses training at St. Luke's Hospital in Aberdeen, South Dakota. I guess that was one of the options open to at that time. I had to work. There was a $75 fee for going in, and I took care of children for a year to save the $75. This was a Depression era. I graduated from there and did some private duty and some general duty in a small hospital in Eureka, South Dakota, where I met a nurse that was a nurse anesthetist and had trained in Duluth, Minnesota. She encouraged me to go to Duluth, Minnesota to take a course in anesthesiology. I became a registered nurse anesthetist and went to work in a local hospital in Duluth, the Miller Memorial Hospital. It was there that I was working when World War II broke out. I remember hearing about Pearl Harbor when I was working at the Miller Memorial Hospital in Duluth, Minnesota. I lived next door to the hospital. It happened, as I recall, on a Sunday afternoon. I was off duty and I heard this on the radio. I don't know how it was announced. The message, I remember that it was very, very startling. And some of the nurses that they used to come to my room for their breaks from the hospital. And I remember their coming in, and of course we were all concerned. I decided to volunteer for service after the war. I think had been on for about 6 months. Another nurse anesthetist and I made the decision that we would go in the service together. One of our first questions asked was, what was your home state? Hers was Wisconsin, and mine was South Dakota, and we never saw each other again until after the end of the service. She went to the Chinese Burma Theater, and I went to the South Pacific. My memory for going into the service, I do not recall where I went to sign up, but I do remember going to Fort Snelling and having a physical, which involved wearing a hospital gown and walking through a men's ward to the X-ray. That was my first time being in a large group of people, and it was rather a shock, I'm sure, to the men on the hospital ward as it was to those of us marching through to the X-ray unit. I was given orders to report to Camp Carson in Colorado Springs. And I remember taking the train to Camp Carson, and I believe it involved about 2 days travel. I sat across the aisle from a young woman, but we did not converse at all. I didn't know where she was going, nor did she know where I was going. We got off at the station in Colorado Springs, and she was assigned to the same unit and camp that I was. There were probably 10 or 12 other nurses there from different parts, and we waited for transportation to take us to Camp Carson, Colorado. My changing from into military life was, of course, taking orders, living with a group of women in the nurses' quarters. Were assigned two to a room, and my assignment, because of my training, was surgery and giving anesthetics. My duties were to work in surgery. At that time, there wasn't any disposables. When we weren't busy, we patched gloves, wrapped surgical equipment to be sterilized. Well, we were there quite a while and at Camp Carson, and we had to go through drilling and training as nurses, and we sometimes had famous visitors that would come and observe what we were doing. One of them was Bing Crosby. That, of course, caused a great deal of interest among both female and male staff that were there. The surrounding area is beautiful. We had drives into the mountains when we were off duty. I'd like to mention that I got my first promotion at Colorado Springs to first lieutenant, and that bothered quite a few there because I'd only been in 6 months. There were nurses that had been there 2 years, but as far as I evaluated, it was because I was a nurse anesthetist that I was promoted. I think I had been in the service about 2 years, and there were more and more outfits being shipped overseas. And one day I went into one of the administrator's office and asked if I was still on limited service. And they said, let us check and see and we'll let you know. 3 days later, I had orders to join the 251st Station Hospital, which had activated at Camp Carson, and they were getting ready to ship out overseas. We were sent on a troop train to California in the San Francisco area and waited to be shipped out overseas. We did not know our destination. We only knew that we were on the West Coast and probably going to the Pacific area. We left on the Smithsonian, which is a cruise ship that was going to Hawaii and been turned into a troop ship. For some reason or other, they put the nurses' corps or group down at the bottom of the ship, and that's where we were stationed. We were 3 weeks on the Pacific without any stops. I was seasick most of the way. Our activity was limited to our own area. We could go on a certain portion of the deck, and that was all. And probably playing cards and singing. And the group of nurses that I was with had certain songs that they sang over and over again. Bell-bottom trousers and coats of navy blue. We were in a very dangerous area somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We wore our life jackets to bed for 3 nights in a row. There was never any light of any kind, including a match, struck after dark. We got through that dangerous area and eventually landed in what I found out later was Australia, but we did not know our destination. We were taken by truck out in the country, and there were tents erected in a cow pasture. There were also cows in the cow pasture. Cows are very curious animals, and the sides of the tent would be rolled up, and in the morning we'd wake up. Oftentimes there was a cow gazing in, chewing its cud and looking down in your face, see what was going on in there. Occasionally we'd see a wallaby hop through there, which is, I interpret it as a small version of a kangaroo. There were birds that made a very raucous noise. They sounded like a maniac shrieking. And our first morning there, when we wakened, these birds were all shrieking away, and Mildred Turner, our chief nurse, said to me, "We must be in Australia." We were not assigned on duty. Australia was a staging area for us. We were staging to follow MacArthur and his troops to wherever destination took us. We were in Australia, I would say approximately 6 months. The weather became cold, and they moved our nurses to a convent. I don't know where the nuns went, but they turned the convent over for nurses' quarters for that time. We resided there. We were always on alert and had to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. I think we were in Brisbane. It may have been 6 months. At one time we did get to take a train to Eureka, I think was the name of the village, and we were given coupon stamps. And the store had yarn, there they called it wool, in balls, and we all bought balls of wool and a crochet hook or knitting needles, and brought it back to our quarters. And somebody, I don't recall who, knew how to show us how to crochet or knit. So we all started making an afghan out of our wool yarn, just partly to occupy our time. I remember going to an Australian restaurant. Their famous food there is steak and eggs. There weren't any napkins, but they had cloth tablecloths, and everybody used the end of the tablecloth for their napkin. They had a beauty parlor there, and instead of leaning back to have your hair shampooed, we leaned forward and put our forehead in the basin, and they shampooed our hair from that angle. I think it almost beats the American way. These are incidental things, but they're what stay in my mind. Again, our group entertained themselves with singing and doing whatever they were permitted to do. We were always on alert, and eventually orders did come that we were to move out. We were issued tropical clothing, and I think we had probably 2 days to get our bedrolls and get our personal things together and be ready to ship out. We were placed on a hospital ship, and our first stop was in New Guinea. There were about 80 nurses in the 251st, female members. 2 of them were physiotherapists, a dietitian, and 2 Red Cross personnel. We were in New Guinea approximately, I'm only guessing, about 6 weeks. This was our first introduction to living in tents in a tropical area. We probably had a 40-watt light bulb in the top of the tent. At sundown, you put down your mosquito bar over your cot and listen to the rats approach and start gnawing, trying to get in. There were a lot of flying insects. You were confined. You could only stay in your tent unless you went. If you went out, they had to know where you were going, and there was only one place to go, and that was probably the officers' club. And you had to go with 2 armed escorts to go leave your tent. We were on New Guinea, I think about 6 weeks, and we were shipped by hospital ship to the island of New Britain, which is fairly close to New Guinea. We are now in jungle territory, which was also true of New Guinea. There's nothing but palm trees and more palm trees and jungle growth. This is when we began service taking care of sick and wounded. The hospital tents were erected in this area, and nurses were assigned their duties. And I worked in surgery or helped the chief nurse in her office at that time. The kind of patients that were treated were that of probably broken bones, head injuries, eye injuries, and general sickness. On the battlefield, when somebody is shot, they're treated by a corpsman and probably taken to a field hospital, where they are then sent to wherever they're designated for future treatment. I was in a station hospital, which was not on the front lines, often close to it, but we did not receive battlefield patients. Well, the surgical unit was in a tent on New Britain. In the surgical tent, I recall, operating room table, the table that went over them, the instrument nurse handing instruments to the surgeon. One of my duties was to train medical corpsmen to give drop ether when they were in combat area. We taught them how to use a ether mask, that I think that was what we called them. And ether comes in a can about the size of a Coca-Cola or other soft drink, and it is dropped onto the mask you slowly, you cover your patient's face and ask them to inhale. And as they pass out, you watch, raise their eyelids and look into their eyes, and you can tell when they've lost their response and they're ready for surgery. The most dangerous thing about giving drop ether is administering too much and causing death. We were always behind MacArthur's advances. We would be on duty and stage and wait for him to make another advance, and then we would follow when they sent us. The next step was by hospital boat to the island of Leyte, which is in the Philippines. While we were stationed on the island of Leyte, General MacArthur had made his advances to Bataan and released the prisoners of war, including the nurse prisoners. They were brought directly to the island of Leyte and placed in our hospital unit, in our nurses' quarters, for us to care for and help process for their return to either to Hawaii or the United States for medical treatment. Now this is just a lighter issue. Their first question when they came into our nurses' quarters was, "Does anybody have an extra lipstick?" That was one of their first. Of course, we'd already been over there 2 years. Our lipstick had long expired, and we had been taking Atabrin for 2 years, which turns your skin yellow. These nurses had been confined in their prison quarters. They were lily white, and it was pretty hard to tell who was the victim and who was the caretaker. If I went on TDY, I was sent to another unit. On the island of Leyte, I had a group that I took on TDY, and they always told us that we wouldn't be sent into an area where there was active fighting, but they failed to tell the Japanese that. So on the island of Leyte, there were a group of us that were sent probably to a field hospital. They weren't ready for us. There were no tents. And we had our army cots out in the open, and come nightfall, there was an air raid warning. And this was about as close as we had been to any activity like this. And I remember giving the order to the nurses, "Let's hit the ground and please don't yell or scream." And they obeyed me. And the next morning when we got up, the men that were in the hospital there, in the tent, said, "We expected to hear somebody scream last night." And I said they were threatened. Well, they had the medics that had their own foxholes to run to. But of course we didn't have a foxhole. We didn't know enough to find one if there had been there, because we hadn't been that close. They only turned the water on for about 20 minutes in the afternoon around 4 o'clock. Our nurses' quarters were always entirely separate from any other part of the hospital personnel, and it was always screened with barbed wire and burlap fencing around it, and there was always an armed guard at the entrance. But come 4 o'clock, when we'd go to the shower area, which were open overhead, there were stalls, but there was no ceiling. Why, that's when our air activity started at low flight level. From Leyte, we were placed on a hospital ship again and sent to Luzon. They were still fighting in the Gulf. Once again, while we went on duty, our men had gone on to Japan, and they were on the way, and we were getting ready to follow when they got the unit set up. And we'd already been overseas 2 years, but we were at the port of debarkation, ready to go, and the bomb was dropped and the war was over. And they held us there until they could get ships to take us back, because we had been overseas 2 years in the jungle. We landed in California. It was right at Thanksgiving time, and we had hopes of being home for Thanksgiving. We'd been overseas 2 years, and we were placed on a troop train, and lo and behold, Thanksgiving dinner was canned turkey. I think I was brought up in an era when we were taught if we were attacked, that is time to attack. And we were attacked at that time. Modern technology I can't help but wonder if we can be the world's keeper, but I'm not one to decide that. It leaves a question in my mind. Through the 60 years since I've been in the service, the 251st nurses, the majority of them, have been bonded in a close relationship for the past 45 years. There has been reunions, annual reunions in different parts of the country where both the enlisted men and the nurses get together sometime towards the end of September of each year. We're the only ones that understand what we went through. There's no way that we can convey to anyone the lifestyle or living that we endured for 2 years. In trying to recall these things, the thing that came to my mind is trivial, but we didn't even have a chair to sit on in our nurses' quarters. We had a cot, an army cot, and our footlocker, and that was it, and a 40-watt bulb in the ceiling. Jane Ditchfield and I had a standing date when we were off duty in the evening. We'd sit on the steps and play cribbage for an hour. My chief nurse, Mildred Turner, worked in South Florida. And the majority of the rest that I was friendly or close to on this side of the United States are now deceased. It was an experience, very trying at times, but I never regretted it.